Amelia, a compassionate young nurse, helps David, a homeless man burdened with regret over losing his daughter 2 decades ago. Driven by a sense of purpose, Amelia embarks on an emotional journey to reunite them. When David and his estranged daughter Sarah meet, past pain and deep secrets resurface, threatening to push them apart once more. Will David's heartfelt explanations heal the rift or deepen the wounds? And can Sarah open her heart to the father she once believed abandoned her? The wind sliced through the narrow city street like icy needles, and Amelia hunched further into her coat, each step crunching through thin patches of frozen snow. She'd just wrapped up a 12-hour shift at the hospital, her tired feet begging for rest. But as she turned the corner by the convenience store, something made her pause. A hunched figure, barely visible in the shadow of a flickering streetlight. The man was curled up against the cold brick, his thin jacket no match for the freezing night. He seemed like he was trying to disappear, to make himself as small as possible. She couldn't ignore him. Amelia always had an eye for people in need, and something about him looked especially vulnerable. His face was hidden, but the slight tremor in his shoulders revealed the chill seeping into his bones. Without thinking, she approached, bending down to his level. "Hey, do you need a blanket?" she asked softly, not wanting to startle him. The man raised his face slowly, eyes clouded with both fatigue and a flash of distrust. Up close, she could see he wasn't as old as she'd first thought, though life had clearly left its mark on him. After a long pause, he gave a reluctant nod, barely meeting her gaze. Before Amelia could stop herself, she was rummaging through her bag, pulling out the spare blanket she always kept for emergencies and a sandwich she hadn't had the chance to eat. "Here," she said, holding them out with a small smile. "My name's Amelia." He took them slowly, his gaze fixed on the ground as he muttered a quiet, "Thank you." When he finally looked up, she saw a flicker of something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps weariness too deep to name. "I'm David," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. She wanted to ask him more, but something in his eyes held her back. As she watched him wrap the blanket around himself, Amelia realized she didn't want this to be the last time they spoke. That night, Amelia lay awake, wondering about the man she'd just met. She tried to imagine his story, piecing together fragments from what little he'd shared, feeling a growing urge to know more. She promised herself she'd return the next evening, hoping he'd still be there. The next day, Amelia made her way back to the spot by the convenience store, scanning the dim street corners, hoping for a sign of David. But the spot was empty, save for the discarded blanket she'd given him, crumpled and abandoned on the icy ground. For 3 days, Amelia returned to the spot, her eyes searching each shadow along the narrow street. Every time, she felt a sinking weight in her chest when she found nothing but the discarded blanket and bits of litter blowing along the icy sidewalks. David had vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, and Amelia felt strangely unsettled by his absence. She couldn't shake the feeling that he'd needed help, that maybe, in some way, she had let him down. The idea gnawed at her. Her friends and co-workers thought she was overthinking it. "Amelia, there are so many people out there like him," her friend Nina reminded her as they shared coffee. "You did what you could," but Amelia couldn't accept that. One evening after work, she made her way to the park where she thought David might be staying. She had heard from some of the local shopkeepers that homeless folks sometimes gathered around the old, worn-down bench in the center. The streets grew quieter as she neared the park, and when she finally reached the bench, she spotted him, or at least a figure that looked like him, huddled beneath layers of worn clothes, his head bowed low. Her relief washed over her in a wave. She approached cautiously, careful not to startle him. "David," she said gently, hoping he remembered her. His head lifted slowly, and she could see the surprise in his tired eyes, then something almost like shame as he averted his gaze. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly, his voice rough and guarded. She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I wanted to make sure you were all right. I hadn't seen you in a few days." He nodded, his shoulders tensing as though bracing himself against an invisible blow. "I don't usually stay in one place for long," he murmured. "People, they get uncomfortable." "Well, I'm not uncomfortable," she said, sitting down beside him on the cold metal of the bench. "Do you need anything? I mean, maybe a warmer coat or some food?" David's mouth tightened and he seemed to shrink into himself. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "People don't just help like this, especially not someone like me." Amelia felt a pang at his words, but answered honestly. "Because I think everyone deserves a little kindness, that's all. And you remind me of someone." He looked at her, frowning. "Who?" She paused, caught off guard by her own words. "My father. He used to struggle in different ways, but I guess I see something familiar in you." She hadn't intended to share this much, but something about David's hollow eyes pulled the truth from her. A strange expression crossed his face, something unreadable. "Well, thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Most people don't stop to even look at me." In the following weeks, Amelia continued to visit him, bringing him small gifts of food, clothes, or even just company when she could tell he needed it most. Gradually, his walls began to lower, and he shared snippets of his past with her. Piece by piece, she learned about the life he'd once had. A good job, a daughter he adored, a wife he'd lost far too soon, and most haunting of all, the accident that had stripped it all away, leaving him both physically and emotionally shattered. One evening, as they sat on the bench watching the last of the evening's sun dip below the horizon, David opened up in a way Amelia had never expected. "I had a daughter," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "She was just a kid when everything went wrong. I lost my job, my health, her mother." He hesitated, his eyes distant. "I tried to keep it together for her, but things fell apart faster than I could hold them. One day, I just couldn't anymore. I thought she'd be better off without me. I didn't want her to remember me this way." Amelia felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to reach out to tell him that he'd been wrong, but she held back, sensing he needed to share this without interruption. After a moment, he looked at her, his expression raw. "I don't know where she is now. I thought she'd be better off, but..." He shook his head, bitterness lacing his voice. "That decision has haunted me every day since." In that moment, Amelia knew she had to help him find his daughter. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as if she'd been meant to cross paths with David, that her life wasn't complete without seeing this through. As soon as she got home that night, Amelia began searching. She stayed up into the early hours, digging through online records, tracing any clue that might lead her to David's daughter. It took days of persistence, sleepless nights, and countless dead ends. But at last, she found something. A woman with his daughter's name working as a social worker in a nearby town. She hesitated, unsure of how to approach her, but decided that a gentle, cautious call might be best. The phone rang once, twice, until a warm voice finally answered. "Hello, this is Sarah." Amelia felt her heart leap into her throat. She cleared her throat, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Hi, my name is Amelia, and I think I know your father." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "My father?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "I don't have a father." Amelia's resolve hardened. "I believe you do, Sarah. His name is David. He's been looking for you." There was a pause so long Amelia feared the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice filled with years of buried hurt. "Where is he?" Amelia's heart pounded as she arranged the meeting, still reeling from her conversation with Sarah. She had sensed the mix of anger, hope, and disbelief in Sarah's voice, as if her words had reopened a wound long since buried. Sarah had agreed to meet David, but her tone held a quiet reservation, a barrier Amelia could feel even through the phone. On the day of the reunion, Amelia guided David to the cafe where Sarah had chosen to meet. She noted the way his hands shook, the uncertainty shadowing his face. "I don't know if I can do this, Amelia," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the ground. What if she hates me?" She placed a reassuring hand on his arm, feeling the frailty beneath his coat. "David, she's here. She wants to see you. That's a start, right?" She managed a small, encouraging smile. "Just be honest with her." They entered the cafe together, and Amelia spotted Sarah seated by the window, her face set in a composed, guarded expression that couldn't hide the nervousness in her eyes. Sarah was striking with her mother's dark, deep-set eyes, yet something of David's reserved demeanor clung to her, making her seem older than her years. As soon as David spotted her, his steps faltered, and Amelia had to gently nudge him forward. "Sarah?" David's voice cracked as he said her name, and in that single word, a lifetime of regret poured out. He held his hands clasped in front of him, as if afraid to reach out. Sarah watched him in silence, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the only sound was the muffled clinking of cups and quiet chatter around them. Finally, Sarah drew a slow breath. "I want to know why you left." Her voice was steady, yet it held an unmistakable edge of hurt. David opened his mouth, closed it, then looked down at his trembling hand. "Sarah, I thought it would be best for you. I was in no shape to be a father. After the accident, I lost everything. Your mother, my job, my health. I didn't want you to see me like that." Sarah's jaw tightened. "So you thought disappearing was the answer? That it wouldn't hurt me?" He winced, her words like a physical blow. I thought you'd forget me? That you'd have a chance at a better life without me dragging you down?" Sarah's face softened, only slightly, as she absorbed his words, but she shook her head, the anger still simmering beneath her controlled exterior. "I needed you, Dad. I needed to know why you left, and no one would tell me. I thought maybe you didn't love me anymore." David's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Sarah, no, I never stopped loving you. Not for a second. I just thought you'd be better off without me. But I was wrong. I know that now." Amelia watched, holding her breath, as Sarah's resolve seemed to crack, her gaze softening for the first time. But just as she seemed on the verge of forgiving him, a figure entered the cafe. A man with a cold, calculating look, his eyes sharp and assessing as they took in David and Sarah. "Sarah?" the man called, his voice laced with authority. Sarah's face froze, the guarded look snapping back into place. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and tense. "I wanted to make sure you're safe," the man replied, his gaze flicking over David with a barely concealed disdain. He extended a hand toward her, his posture rigid. "This man, he's the one who abandoned you, isn't he?" Amelia's stomach dropped as she realized who he was, Sarah's adoptive father. Sarah had briefly mentioned being taken in by a family after David's departure, but she hadn't shared the detail. Amelia could sense the tension between them, the way Sarah seemed to shrink under his gaze. David's face fell as he registered the situation. He looked at Sarah, his voice wavering. Is this what you want, Sarah, for him to decide?" The man's mouth curled into a small, contemptuous smile. "You had your chance, and you walked out on her. You have no right to be here." Sarah's eyes darted between her adoptive father and David, her face clouded with confusion. Amelia could see her fighting an internal battle, torn between the loyalty she felt for the man who had raised her and the rekindled longing for the father she had lost. Finally, Sarah took a deep breath and turned to her adoptive father. "Please, can you let me handle this on my own?" Her voice was calm but firm, a quiet strength emerging as she met his gaze directly. The man's face darkened. "Don't forget who was there for you when you had no one," he said, his voice barely masking a warning tone. He cast one last withering look at David before stalking out of the cafe, leaving a thick tension hanging in the air. When he was gone, Sarah turned back to David, her face softening as she spoke. "I didn't know what happened to you, Dad. I had so many questions, but no one would give me answers. I felt abandoned, but I also tried to understand." David's shoulders slumped with relief, and he finally reached out, his hand trembling as he rested it on hers. "I never meant to leave you like that, Sarah. I thought you'd be better off, but I see now that I was wrong. I lost you once, and if there's any way to make things right..." Amelia could see the final walls breaking down between them as Sarah took a deep, steadying breath, her hand tightening around David. "I don't know how this will work, but I want to try. I want to know you again." In that moment, Amelia felt the weight of all their choices, their regrets and their hopes, bind them together. She realized that Sarah's forgiveness wouldn't heal David's wounds completely, nor would it erase the years of pain, but it was a beginning, a fragile, precious chance to rebuild. As they left the cafe together, Amelia sensed a shift in David. His shoulders, once slumped under the burden of guilt, now held a trace of hope, as though he was slowly learning to carry his past without letting it define his future. And by his side, Sarah held his arm with a tentative yet determined grip, ready to navigate the road ahead, no matter how long or difficult it might be. As the days passed, Amelia watched David and Sarah tentatively begin to build a bridge between their fractured past and uncertain future. Their reunions were marked by both joy and sorrow, each one bringing a mixture of long-buried memories and painful realizations. David, who had carried so much guilt for so many years, was learning to forgive himself, a process Amelia knew would take time. Sarah, still grappling with the wounds left by his absence, found herself feeling both love and resentment toward this man she barely knew, yet could never forget. One afternoon, as David and Sarah were meeting for lunch, Amelia joined them, observing the delicate way they navigated each other's presence. David's face would light up with each story Sarah shared about her life, her career, her passion for helping others, the hardships she had overcome. He listened with an intensity that showed his silent pride, though he often seemed to hold himself back, as if afraid to intrude upon a life he felt he no longer had any claim to. Yet for all their caution, something remarkable began to emerge between them, a shared understanding, a slow healing. Amelia was often struck by the way Sarah began to fill in the quiet spaces in David's stories, piecing together fragments of her own memories with his, each recollection stitching together a tapestry that felt whole, despite its flaws. One crisp autumn morning, David and Sarah met Amelia at a small park, where the golden leaves drifted lazily in the breeze. They took a long walk, meandering through the paths, as David recounted the early days of his life with Sarah's mother, the woman he had loved so deeply and whose absence had left him broken. Amelia saw Sarah listening intently, her expression a mixture of sadness and yearning, her father's words giving her glimpses into a life she had only ever imagined. After a while, Sarah stopped by a large, worn bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. She looked at David, a question in her eyes. "Why didn't you ever try to find me?" she asked, her voice steady but soft, her gaze unwavering. David's face fell, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his remorse. "I thought about it," he confessed. "I thought about it every day, but I felt like I'd lost the right. I thought you were happier without me." His voice grew quiet. "I didn't want to hurt you all over again." Amelia felt a pang in her chest as she watched Sarah consider his words. She could see that David's answer hadn't resolved her pain entirely, but it had given her something precious: honesty. They sat in silence for a while, the gentle rustling of leaves the only sound. Finally, Sarah reached for her father's hand, her grip firm but gentle. "You can't go back and change things," she said quietly. "But we have now, and that's something. Let's not waste it." David looked at her, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "I'll do my best," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'll be there for you, for as long as I have left." The weight of their words seemed to settle in the air, a shared commitment, unspoken yet understood. Amelia smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her as she realized she'd been a part of something extraordinary, a reunion that might not have happened if she hadn't stopped that night in the cold. In the months that followed, Amelia kept in touch with David and Sarah, watching their relationship deepen with every visit, every shared laugh, every tearful moment. She was often invited to join them, and on many evenings, they shared simple meals, talking late into the night about hopes, fears, and dreams long postponed. One day, as they were seated around Amelia's small dining table, Sarah turned to her father, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Have you thought about going back to school, Dad?" she asked. "You always told me you wanted to be a teacher." David chuckled, the idea seeming foreign yet enticing. "I'm a bit old for that, don't you think?" he replied, smiling. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "It's never too late, and you're always telling me how much you regret not following through." Amelia watched as David pondered this, a spark of excitement in his eyes. She felt a surge of pride, knowing that Sarah's gentle encouragement was opening a door he'd long thought closed. With a slow nod, David looked at Sarah, his expression thoughtful. Maybe I'll think about it." In that moment, Amelia knew that David had finally begun to let go of the past. The ghosts that had haunted him for so many years were fading, replaced by something new, hope. As they bid farewell that evening, Amelia hugged David and Sarah, watching them disappear into the autumn dusk, their laughter lingering in the air. She stood alone, smiling as she realized the incredible journey they'd all been a part of. Her heart was full, knowing she had played a role in helping them find each other, and in some way, she had found something she didn't know she needed: purpose, connection, and the knowledge that a single act of kindness could transform lives. As she closed her door, she felt a quiet satisfaction. If she had the chance, she knew she'd do it all over again, for there was something deeply fulfilling in bringing light to lives that had known only shadows. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more heartwarming tales that show the power of kindness and resilience. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who might need a reminder of the incredible strength in forgiveness. Up next, another inspiring story awaits. Click on the video appearing on your screen to discover more.